Prison, jail sentences all depends on the crime, and when you think life in prison is just simply that, well, sometimes it's not exactly what it seems. But for some cases, an exact number is just as shocking as the life sentence. For example, Larry Hoover is an American former mobster and gang kingpin, as he was known as the founder of the Chicago street gang and gangster disciple. In 1969, Hoover and David Barksdale called a truce on deciding to combine both of their respective rival gangs, Supreme Gangsters and the Black Disciples, together to become the Black Gangster Disciple Nation. In 1974, after the leader of the Black Disciples, David Barksdale, had died of kidney failure stemming from injuries incurring in a 1970 shooting, Hoover took over the reins of the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, and he deemed himself as the chairman of the crew. At the time, though, the Disciples had control of the Chicago South Side turf, and under Hoover's rule, the Black Gangster Disciple Nation took over a majority of the Chicago narcotics trade. Currently, he is serving 6 life sentences in the ADX Florence Prison Facility in Colorado. Apparently, previously to this sentencing, he was sentenced to a life imprisonment of plus 200 years for a 1973 killing. But following a 17-year investigation, turns out there was more under his belt, as he was convicted of conspiracy, extortion, money laundering, and running a continual criminal enterprise from state prison. While Hoover was incarcerated, he ran the gang's illicit narcotics trade both in prison and on the streets, starting from Chicago's west side and then later extending throughout the United States. He then received another life term in 1997, although he has made multiple attempts to have his sentence shortened. As of July 2022, Hoover confirms that he is no longer affiliated with the Gangster Disciples and he wants no part of the gang whatsoever. He also claims that he was no longer the Larry Hoover people sometimes talk about, or he was written about in the papers, or the crimes figure described by the government. Many believe it was just a ruse though for his plan to have his sentence reduced, but either way, appealed. 200 years is wild, but what about 400 years? Harvey Carignan was arrested in 1975 in the United States, as he is known as the want-to-add killer. On July 31st, 1949, Carignan killed 58-year-old Laura Showalter during an attempt of a non-consensual physical altercation in the territory of Alaska. In September 16, 1949, he attempted to hurt another woman, Christine Norton, and was arrested the next day. Carignan was convicted of first-degree killings and physical violations with intent to commit harm, and the jury did not recommend mercy, and instead, he received a mandatory death sentence. However, Carignan won a new trial on his trial conviction in 1951 on the grounds that his confession was improperly obtained. An officer interrogating Carignan had told him he would not be executed if he had just confessed to the crime. Carignan was arrested again on September 24th, 1974, as he was charged with attempted killings and aggravated sodomy. Carignan pleaded insanity, claiming God had ordered him to kill harlots. As his defense failed, in 1975 he was then found guilty on both charges. After his conviction, Carignan had a mental evaluation and he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, and months later he was found guilty of indecent liberty, sodomy upon minors, and 2 additional counts of aggravated sodomy. Carignan was then sentenced to 400 years, but eventually the sentence was totaled to 60 years in prison. Either way, he died at 95 in prison. He was 95 years old, I meant. In 2013, Ariel Castro was sentenced to not 200, not 400, but 1,000 years, as he pleaded over 937 counts of non-consensual physical aggravation on young women. All whole, he had kidnapped, imprisoned in his home before killing them. His MO was offering the victims a ride, to which he brought them to his home, where they were never seen by anyone else ever again. After the first 2 victims, there were vigils held by the public, to which Ariel had the audacity to attend. In the case of Georgina Lynn DeHus, where she was missing in 2004, she was on her way home. She was friends with Ariel Castro's daughter, and she thought, well, spending time with my friend wouldn't be a big deal. When DeHus' mothers confirmed for her to go home, it was Ariel who actually supposed to take her back home, and after a year of her disappearance, the FBI released a sketch of Ariel that would take another 10 years. DeHus and another victim, Michelle Knight, would break free with a child, as one of them was unfortunately impregnated by Castro. And then they were able to escape and send him to jail. After his first court appearance at court, he was told his bail would be set after each kidnapping of $2 million, equaling $8 million in total. Prosecutors sought that the death penalty in addition to the other charges of killings and aggravating harm, but his attorneys of course tried to plead him as not guilty. But in summary, his charge resulted him in life in prison plus 1,000 years, all without parole. Castro fortified his rights to appeal and could not profit in any way due to his crimes. He fortified his assets as well as his house, where he held the victims hostage as it being demolished. He was also fined $100,000, and after all that, he took his own life, not fully facing his crimes in jail. Maoupa Cedric Maake was arrested in December 1997 for the Wemmer Pan killings and was convicted over 100 charges of 27 killings and attempted killings, robberies, and so much more. He was sentenced to 27 life sentences, including 1,159 years and 3 months additional, in a total 1,340 years in prison. The Wemerpan killings involved several victims, as first were men and women just walking alone who Cedric would just hit with a rock, and the next group of victims were couples in cars where he'd fire weapons on them, and the second criminal profile led to the police in connecting in another crime of victims dying via hammer smash, and realized it's the same guy. He stole a victim's shirt that had his name on it and used that as an alias, and he was caught, placed under custody for his crimes. Later on, while he was in jail, after 1 month he admitted guilt and confessed to the killings. Aside Castro, there was Martin John Bryant, who was also receiving life, but not just one time. He got 30 life sentences, an additional 1,652 years, and never to be released. See, Martin spent his life in Australia, where he is from, but even as a child, people noticed he had masochistic tendencies, like pulling off the snorkel of other kids while they were diving, or cutting down trees on a neighbor's property. He was described by teachers as being distant and unemotional, as he was constantly picked on by the other kids. After he was caught tormenting animals and was suspended from school, he returned as he was still needed special help, as he was deteriorating academically as well as behaviorally. Even according to PsychoValves, after his case, he had an IQ of 66 and equivalent to an 11-year-old. So what did Martin do? Well, because he was extremely antisocial, the suspicion of wanting attention, Martin, aged 29 at this time, opened fire on civilians, killing 35 and injuring 23. Indiscriminately, in a short time, he eventually got a hostage, who he also ended up killing, resulting in him getting arrested and sent to trial. Aside the 1,000 plus years, can you even get sentenced even longer? The answer is yes, of course you can. Hitting at 12 consecutive life sentences and 3,318 years without parole goes to James Eagan Holmes. This carrot-top looking Sagittarius was charged for letting off fire and aiming at civilians at a shopping mall center and the movie theater, killing 12, injuring 70, mainly 58 from the shots. It is the deadliest mass killings by a lone perpetrator in history of Colorado, and the state's second deadliest mass killings, just after the 1999 Columbine High School massacre. Holmes was arrested minutes later in his car outside the cinema. Later, he had rigged his apartment with homemade explosives and devices, as he was hoping the police would get involved and explode. They were actually defused though by the county sheriff's office bomb squad the day after the shooting. Fearing copycat crimes, the movie theaters were actually showing the same film across the United States, increasing their security. Holmes confessed to the shooting but pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. The county prosecutors sought his death penalty, and on August 29th, Holmes was just giving 12 life sentences, one for every person he killed, as well as receiving 3,318 years for the attempted deaths of those wounded and rigging his apartment with explosives. Now you can get 3,318 years plus the 12 sentences seems a lot, but can you get a longer extended amount of time? The answer is yes. Adnan Oktar was a Turkish cult leader who was also acting as a preacher, conspiracy theorist, engaging in massive campaigns, trying to lure Westerners in alternative versions of Islam when it wasn't. He was perverting the actual religion for his own selfish gain, and as a result, he was engaging in criminal gang activity, military espionage, and harm against minors and other charges for, can you guess how many years? It's not 2,000, it's not 4,000, but 8,658 years in prison. Apparently, before his arrest, he made his own book on creation, trying to do lectures on his version of religion to gather more cult following. Even after his arrest, he tried to do it again, where he filed more than 5,000 lawsuits against individuals for defamation, and he is known as a Sunni Zealot by those who knew him, or Sunni Zealot for those who knew him, and even though he denied that's true, I don't know. But since he had a large connection financially, he was actually able to get away with a lot of stuff over the years. It wasn't until the retrial that happened in 2022 was he sentenced to that 8,658 years in prison. Darron Bennalford Anderson is a long name to say, but it's also his sentence, as it was also long. In 1994, he was arrested and even noted one of the greatest amount of jail time given as a result of an appeal. Found for his guilty crime of physically harming an elderly woman by non-consensual basis in Tulsa County, including larceny, robbery, and kidnapping, he was sentenced for 2,250 years, which seems fine, but then he tried again to reappeal, only to be reconvicted and resentenced to an additional 9,500 years. In total, Darron received over 11,250 as an official sentence in prison. But considering it's impossible for the average person to live that long, the judge ended up giving him a break and said, okay, you know what, I'll reduce it to 500 years. And I think that's safe to say that's enough time for someone. What do you think? Next, we have an even bigger number, of course, which makes sense to me. How could they even calculate these things? But Jamal Zougam was one of 6 men of an attack on a Madrid train in 2004. He was detained on 13th of March 2004, accusing of multiple counts of killings, attempted killings, stealing a vehicle belonging to a violent organization, and 4 counts of carrying out violent acts. Spain's newspaper reported that 3 witnesses testified to seeing him leave a rucksack abroad with one of the trains to explode, specifically one that exploded at Santa Eugenia's station. The attack resulted in killing 193 people, injuring about 2,050. According to the History of Spain, it was one of their deadliest attacks since 1988. On the 31st of October 2007, he was convicted of 191 charges of killings and 1,856 charges of attempted killings, receiving a sentence of, are you ready? 42,922 years of confinement. A Spaniard, Emilio Suarez Tojoras, who supplied the dynamite in return for the narcotics, was also sentenced to a similar sentence of 34,715 years. And finally, this one wasn't that bad in comparison to the others, like in regards to killings or attacks. This was just different. This was about money. Apparently, the cause of this crime was so egregious it resulted in the biggest sentencing so far in history. Chamoy Thipyaso was sentenced for 141,078 years. Why? Because of a pyramid scheme. But it wasn't just any ordinary pyramid scheme. It was a fraud case that led more than 16,000 Thai citizens affected that have an estimate of $200 million to $301 million. In the late 1960s, Chamoy started the chit fund called the Mae Chamoy Fund, which was made to look like an oil share with high returns. Due to her connections with the Royal Thai Air Force, the Petroleum Authority of Thailand, the fund was able to sustain itself for a remarkably long time. Her connections to the military was a huge factor in political and business power, and so it's apparent its military backing made the scheme seem legitimate. The scheme drew over 16,231 clients and was to not shut down until the mid-1980s. The fund had a large number of politically powerful investors from the military and even the royal household, and such, there was calls for the government to bail out the banks and chit funds. After discussion with the king, the nature of which was not made public, the fund was shut down and Chamoy was arrested. She was held by secret by the Air Force for several days, and her trial was not held until after the losses of the military and royal personnel involved in being recovered. On July 27, 1989, Chamoy and 7 accomplices were convicted of the corporate fraud, and she was sentenced out of a total 141,078 years of life imprisonment sentence in prison. But Thai law at the time stated that the maximum sentence could only be up to 20, so she was reduced twice. And she was released in 1993, and the wackiest sentencing, I think, takes the cake in history. And speaking of history, that's all for today. Be sure to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. My name is Jess, and I wish you all the best. Bye.